Hello and welcome to the First Investigations Live. My name's Emma Guy and I'm one of the investigative journalists here at the Canary.
My name's Maryam, Jameela, and I'm the other half of the investigations couple at the Canary, and we're really excited to have you all join us for the First Investigations Live event. I think first, Emma, if you want to maybe explain what you specialise in, we'll start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I specialise in financial tracking and human rights violations.
And I specialise in largely counter-terror things and surveillance, things like that. And yeah, there's a little thing flashing up on the screen to show you. So let us know if you've got any questions for our panelists or for us. And we've got two people from some really amazing organizations, and we're just going to bring them in a sec. And what we're going to do is discuss the Shawcross review that's coming up in relation to Prevent. We'll be talking about education and healthcare in relation to Prevent. There's been loads of stories about kids that are being surveilled, patients that are treated unfairly, and we've got the perfect panel to go through some of those things with you.
Fantastic. Shall we meet our guests?
Yeah, let's do it. Hi, welcome everyone. So Layla, would you like to introduce yourself and your organization?
Yeah, my name's Dr. Layla Aitlhadj and I'm the director at Prevent Watch. We're an organization that provides free support and guidance for people who are impacted by Prevent. So I'm usually the first point of contact when people call through to our helpline. And to date, we've helped nearly 600 individuals with their cases against Prevent.
Thank you. Asfar, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name's Asfar. I'm Asfar Shafi in research at CAGE, which is an advocacy organization which supports people impacted by policies of what's known as the war on terror, so counter-terror policies like Prevent and so on. We started around in 2003 to document people held in the Guantanamo Bay facility in Cuba, and since then it kind of grown into various aspects of counterterrorism, war on terror, and so on.
Okay, thank you. So I think maybe the first place to start is to ask the both of you if you can help us to define what pre-crime policing is when it comes to Prevent.
Do you want to go first, Asfar, or should I? Okay, so with pre-crime policing and Prevent specifically, it's that it basically falls well outside of what we all understand to be any kind of criminal act or criminal intention. So even the idea of catching somebody before they engage in an act, in a criminal act, is actually well after where Prevent operates. So if you think of the timeline of Prevent, it's well before any intention or any act of preparation is even considered. And so usually what you're going on is not any act of preparation or intention. With pre-crime, you're going on ideas of sort of behavior and traits and characteristics that could potentially make somebody vulnerable in the future to some kind of act. And all of these notions, of course, come straight out of like sci-fi. There's no evidence to suggest that you can predict who is going to be a future criminal. You know, we can't predict who's going to be a future murderer or a future pedophile, and yet somehow we're expected to believe that we can predict who's going to become, you know, or be vulnerable to becoming a future terrorist. And so this is essentially where Prevent lies, and notions of pre-crime have been debated for a very long time, and Prevent sits very squarely in that space.
Thank you. I think it's interesting that you say it's like sci-fi, because as for, I think there's a report that you wrote called Stranger Than Fiction, which mentions that very thing right at the beginning. Would you like to explain what that report is a little bit?
And hopefully I don't remember things I write about, but so yeah, the report called Stranger Than Fiction is published last year by the Transnational Institute based in Amsterdam, I think. So it's written by myself and Asim Qureshi, who is a research director at CAGE. I guess talking about pre-crime policing in the broader sense, including Prevent, but also like the European manifestations of prevent. So outside of Britain, it's often referred to as countering violent extremism policies, so CVE. Basically, just compare and contrast to the various ways that CVE policies are played out in like France, the Netherlands, and Britain. I think that the main thing we identified is, these policies came out of a certain like historical juncture where in the early thousands, turn the millennium, there was increased interest in sort of like pre-criminal policing, surveillance, and so on and so forth, and how that became more popular after like the war on terror and so on, because it became less an issue of policing people for, I guess, doing bad things, committing crimes, committing violence, and more cases spotting who among this population could potentially be a threat somewhere down the line, and can gain popularity off the back of that. And obviously, we sort of trace it back to let's have like I think the examples that often used is I think Minority Report by Philip K. Dick, which kind of introduced the idea of pre-crime there, so kind of made that connection there and expanded further from there.
Yeah, and I think it's certainly something which does sound dystopian, the idea that you can anticipate crime before it happens, because I think with prevent, it's been fairly well established that it doesn't actually prevent anything from happening. It's more about surveillance and targeting Muslims. What do you think is the impact on, because obviously prevent isn't the only form of pre-crime policing. It sort of has lots of other manifestations in policing in this country. So what do you think is the impact of prevent in society at large?
I think if you look at prevent itself, as much as we've been, saying that actually, prevent isn't working, it doesn't say what it's supposed to say on the tin, at least, which is that it's supposed to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. There's been zero evidence to show that. Even if we say, look, this needs to end and prevent needs to be removed, the impact it's already had on society, and not just prevent as the label prevent, but all of the notions behind it, has been really damaging. If you look at loads of the institutions, so from the education to healthcare and even the private sector now, right, where prevent and notions of prevent and prevent rhetoric have become embedded and institutionalized, you can actually now remove prevent and you would still have all of these ideas and all of these suspicions of essentially, the Muslim community and even some of the other communities that are now being targeted with these same notions. So you can now remove prevent, but you'll still have the pre-crime notions. You'll still have this idea that actually certain individuals, rather than certain acts, may make somebody a criminal, right, in the future. So you're looking at the individuals who are, even if they're like 5-year-old Muslim children, right, in nursery, you're looking at them like, you have a higher risk of being someone who's going to be a threat later on in the future. And what it's done is it's damaged the trust in some very important relationships, like the teacher-student relationship, the teacher-parent relationship, the doctor-patient relationship. We had one call today from somebody who, they hadn't been referred to prevent, but they were absolutely terrified in seeking help for their child because they know about prevent, because they know that the questions they were being asked were not questions of the well-being of their child, but were questions that they felt were a little bit unusual about, their child's faith and stuff like that. So now they're coming away and they're thinking, do I proceed? Do I seek the support that my child needs or not? So it's caused a lot of damage. And this is one of the things that has never been acknowledged by the government at all. None of the harms of what prevent and what notions of pre-crime are doing have actually been acknowledged. And it works both ways. Like there's the people impacted, but there's also the people who are implementing it. So, the teachers, as far as they're concerned, they're just doing their job, and prevent duty has been embedded with their safeguarding duties. The doctors think they're just doing their job. And you can imagine as we move further in time and you get new people come into social work, new people come into the medical field, new people come into the teaching field who have no idea of what a world pre-prevent looks like, this is going to be normal for them. These notions and ideas are completely normal. They're not even going to have a reference point to say, well, actually, there was safeguarding previously and it didn't look like this and it functioned perfectly fine. This is going to be their new world. It's sort of like a pre-prevent world and there's a post-prevent world. And anyone who wasn't in existence pre-prevent is not even going to understand that we lived in a world before these notions.
I think that's such an important point, that it's like layers of coercion that are being pushed onto children from such a young age. But of course, like you say, there's going to be, like, a lot of my family are in the NHS, and they have spoken a lot about the prevent training that they're asked to go to. And so they're sitting there in the prevent training, looking around the room, thinking, well, these are my colleagues and some of them are my friends. What do they think about this? And how much are they going to push it if I don't? And I think there's also a opposition here where there's the idea that prevent is done for safety and security. But I feel like it does beg the question, the safety and security of who? Because Layla, what you've just described is harm that's being carried out against certain communities. I suppose there's something that you could speak to in terms of how the term British values has been really important to how prevent has developed over the last sort of decade or so.
Sure, yeah, and I think just to return to the point that Layla mentioned about how prevent can exist without existing as a policy per se, I think is important, because there's like a cultural project of prevent which has been in the works for a while too. Like, it's not just a program, it's also a way it's practiced, and I definitely underscore that. In terms of British values, so that was first introduced to prevent in 2011, right? So in 2011, there's a revision of prevent, a rebrand, a new edition, whatever you want to call it, following a review, internal review by the then coalition government. So in 2010 and 11, they reviewed it, and they came up with a new program, and it basically more tightly defined prevent to the cultural political values of the new government, which they identified through British values. And so British values are very like milquetoast ideas like respect for democracy, rule of law, mutual respect and tolerance for one another, and so on and so forth. Like, nothing exceptional in the sense. What they did was sort of tie this surveillance police apparatus to this idea of values, and sort of legitimizing the clampdown on communities through the lens of like they fall outside the purview of what we understand to be the proper British citizen, right? So on that point, so basically British Values came in 10 years ago this year. It's part of this sort of like I guess the more right-wing version of prevent that came out at that point, and I think it's important to recognize how that legitimized a more overtly ideological approach by prevent in the last decade, and I was sort of embedded it within sort of the cultural consciousness of public sector bodies in the country.
That's really interesting. Before we get straight into the Shawcross review, Maryam, for context, maybe you'd like to summarize it in some way before we go into it.
Well, what it is an institutionally racist and oppressive and Islamophobic government reviewing itself, basically. So Shawcross is the person who's going to be heading up the prevent review that's coming up, and this has got a huge amount of opposition from activists, various organizations, including Cage and Prevent Watch, who are taking the government to task on a prevent review. Because of all the things that we've already discussed so far, you can understand why reviewing prevent, a reform of prevent, isn't going to undo that harm. It's not going to address those harms, and it's not going to help the communities that need to be helped. So maybe next, if we go to Layla, you've got Prevent Watch is doing their own review. If you want to explain what that is.
So given the criticisms of the government's William Shawcross review, obviously there was criticisms about him himself and the fact that he shouldn't be, he's not an independent reviewer. There's issues around the scope and the terms of reference of the review. And there's also issues with the way in which the government's attitude has come forward with this. I mean, they promised a review in 2019. A lot of people who raised concerns and criticisms about Prevent felt like, yes, okay, finally, we're going to get a review. Even people who want to end Prevent were thinking, okay, at least they'll have a review, and then, they can see some of the harms and at least acknowledge, baby steps towards it. And the attitude was, okay, first it was Lord Carlisle without any process. And he was an independent. He actually played a part in Prevent. And now there's William Shawcross. So a lot of people boycotted this taking part in this review. And off the back of that, I think over 550 organizations and individuals boycotted the Shawcross review, right? Even though all of these individuals come from very different backgrounds in terms of how they feel about Prevent, and in fact, even what they want to do going forward with Prevent. So everyone agrees that they should end Prevent, even if from that 550 coalition. Off the back of that, we've helped to organize what we've called the People's Review of Prevent. It's been something that has been discussed for a while now, and we feel that the time is right to launch this alternative platform, essentially, so that everyone who is saying, no, I'm not going to engage in the government's review, but still has something to contribute, still has an experience, and still has evidence to contribute, can feel that they can contribute without lending any credibility or being complicit in giving any credibility to the government's whitewash and sort of rubber stamping exercise, essentially, which is what we feel it's going to be. So it's really important. We just launched it a few days ago. We've got a call for evidence. So that call for evidence is for anybody who's been processed through Prevent. So we're not just thinking about people who have been referred to Prevent, but anyone who feels they've been impacted by Prevent, because Prevent has created this environment. It might even be people who have received Prevent funding and it's impacted them, or, for example, people who have lost funding because they don't want to engage with Prevent. So the call for evidence is quite broad on anyone who has kind of been processed through what they feel is Prevent and the Prevent environment. So that's called the People's Review of Prevent, and it has its own dedicated website at peoplesreview.org. Sorry, the People's Review of Prevent.org.
Thank you. I think it's fantastic that there is that initiative, because, as you say, there needs to be a platform to acknowledge what's happened. And so many times when there are these reviews of Prevent and they come from organizations, they tend to include case studies, because there are so many stories and so many people that are impacted by this, but they're not the people that are necessarily given a platform by mainstream media or are considered by white populations to have suffered some harm in the first place. Asfa, would you like to explain a little bit about Cage's approach to reviews of Prevent and possible reforms of Prevent?
Yes, I think what's important to recognize in terms of the current review, the short course review, is it's a quote from who was then security minister at the time, Ben Wallace MP. So he said in Parliament, I think in 2018, before the review was, I think, that whenever I hear people criticize Prevent and I ask, okay, what would you do? They just describe Prevent and they come back to the bit about the Prevent brand being tainted. So I think it's important to recognize that the way the government are approaching it and have been approaching it, and sort of are very clear in how they're approaching it for the last few years, is that they see the issues with Prevent as clear, like purely a matter of PR, like being perceived badly, and they pin that down. That is the reason is being perceived badly is because these so-called extremist adjacent groups, like Cage, like Prep Watch, apparently responsible for this, rather than dealing with the actual realities of the program, has impacted communities and people. So it's very much surface level. We understand it. The review through and through is being very surface level review, looking at how the government can basically continue to prevent in a slightly different form, maybe a slightly different name, looks slightly different, feels slightly different, but ultimately the program, like fundamental mechanics of it will continue. So we oppose that. We recognize that's an issue. It's not a solution by any means. Like I mentioned, 10 years ago, this year, 10 years ago last month even, like there was a review of Prevent, it came out and made it worse, right? It made it more and more tightly defined ideologically, tightly defined politically, and it's not as where we are now. So we recognize we can't keep going through this cycle of decade-long review every decade. We sort of give Prevent new lease of life, or maybe gets new stakeholders involved there, and sort of accepts the premises of Prevent, but allows to continue standard reform. So we oppose the review, as it's clear that government's not interested in fundamentally looking at, dealing with, reconciling with the fact that Prevent does not do anything other than destroy communities, narrow space for political organizing, marginalized already marginalized societies, already marginalized communities in society. So we're not engaging with it, and we're clear about that. And I guess the point is that we see the review in two parts. One is a concession to the fact that people have been speaking up against it for over a decade now, and its reputation as. We also recognize it as, on one hand, a concession. On the other hand, it means to sort of co-opt opposition to it as well. Maybe get people around the table who otherwise would not want to engage with Prevent. We get academics on board. They mentioned an academic board around the short course review. Basically, realign it somewhat with civil society, and sort of give it a new lease of life. So I think it's important that people recognizes, I guess, not fall for it, and sort of allow for this to continue, sort of charade of democracy.
That's really interesting as far. So essentially, what we're saying is that what we think might happen is that it might just be rebranded?
Effectively, yeah. All very slight ameliorations that ultimately don't challenge the fundamental underpinnings of Prevent and maybe apply to new communities and new people, just expand it further rather than in any way shrink it, retract it, or do away with it. That's what we want.
And I think the issue of branding is something which is not changing at its core. And like Layla also mentioned, you can't undo what's been done. And there's been so many different versions of it over the years that clearly there's a view that the Shawcross Review, nothing equitable can come from it. There's no good that can come from it. So what do you think is needed? So for example, Layla, with the alternative People's Review, what is the kind of aim with doing something like that? Like what's going to be done with the submissions that people send in?
So all of the submissions that come in will be taken as part of the review, and of course we'll produce a report at the end. What is crucially unique about this particular review will be that it will do what the government has never done, which is it will actually look at the people impacted. The government have been calling for practitioners of Prevent, for people who are essentially, being paid by Prevent to do Prevent. If you're being paid to keep Prevent going, I mean, you're hardly going to go in and talk yourself out of a job, are you? No. So there are vested interests here. If you look at one of the objectives of the Prevent review, the Shawcross Prevent review, it says how to respond to criticisms and complaints. Okay, this is one of their objectives. They're not saying, okay, we're going to look at where these criticisms and complaints have come from and why. No, how to respond to it. So it really is a PR exercise, as Asfar mentioned, in terms of, we just need to understand how to back these things. I think so far, nobody has actually listened to the people on the ground who are impacted by Prevent, whether they are the people who are having this internal conflict of, what do I do? I'm employed in this job. They're making me do Prevent training. I recognize that, it's massively Islamophobic and it's tapping into biases. I'm looking at my colleagues are looking at me, we're all looking at each other with this lens of suspicion. These people who are on the ground, as well as the people who are being referred, as well as the people who don't feel safe going into what should be safe spaces, be it to their schools, be it to their GPs, because of the fact that Prevent is there. None of these people have had their voice heard. So ultimately what this will provide is at least a platform, at the very least, a platform for these voices to be heard. And, the media can also be a bit difficult as well. Sometimes when you have these stories, people don't want to come forward and they don't want to give their story to the media because they're afraid of what's going to happen, because historically, anyone who has raised a criticism or complaint about Prevent or who has come forward with their story has always been discredited by, the Prevent industry, essentially, and by government. Their stories either been, dismissed as a myth, or the organizations, Prevent Watch, Cage, any other organization that speaks up, or academics who speak up, are smeared because, essentially, why would you complain and criticize the government's policy? So we're hoping that this platform will at least provide an opportunity for people who, and there are a lot of people as well who say, well, I have all this evidence, whether it's academics or otherwise, I have all this evidence. I really want someone to know about it, but I don't want to engage with the Shawcross review. But there's no alternative. So we want to come away from the terms of reference that have been set by the same people who have introduced Prevent. You can't expect your oppressors to be the same people who are going to get you out of that oppression. We can't keep expecting to go through this cycle again and again and expect the government who, have exported Prevent as, it's something that is financially lucrative for them. They've exported it around the world. We can't expect that they are going to come in and they're going to save those very people to which the harms are being produced, because they just have no interest of why would they? It creates that environment of suspicion. It creates the money. It creates all the things that they need in order to rule. Divide the community, rule. Oh, it's Islamophobic. Oh, no, we tackle all forms of extremism, surely. Let's impact a few other communities and tick those boxes. And, two wrongs don't make a right. Just because you're no longer just focusing on the Muslim community, it doesn't mean that Prevent is any better.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think the media complicity really greases the wheels here of Prevent, because if there isn't any robust critique of the government as a whole, or if it happens in too small a way, where it's kind of like, well, now we've got Prevent and it's here and it can't be taken away, so let's rebrand it as for, like you said, or let's reform it in some other way, rather than actually acknowledging that it's a form of oppression and a form of state violence. Do you feel like, what would you like to see from media outlets in terms of how it's reported?
So was that question to me?
Go ahead.
I think media are difficult. I'm sure Asfar will agree in terms of their own experience as well. Sometimes you cannot get them to report on certain things. So, the launch, for example, of the alternatives, the alternative to the Shawcross review, which is the People's Review of Prevent. How many mainstream media organizations picked that up? They all sent the PR, but how many actually picked it up? How many said, oh, the people are actually doing a review at the same time as the government? What's this about? At least show some interest. So that expectation of mainstream media kind of coming forward and putting these things out and letting people know about it is very, very low. To be fair, a lot of the stories that are shock factor stories have been reported in the mainstream media. These are usually, the stories of young children, like the 4-year-olds and the 11-year-olds who are reported for really silly things, like, the 4-year-old who mispronounced the word cucumber as cookabomb, the child who mispronounced terraced house as misspelt terraced house as terraced house, and then the recent one of the Fortnite case where a child was talking about playing with guns and bombs, and he was referring to the online game Fortnite. And then the most recent one, which just was last week, is the alms case, where a child said if he had a lot of money, he would give alms to the oppressed, as in charity to the oppressed. And his teacher straight away referred him to Prevent, because she assumed, without following up even with a single question of what do you mean, right, to this child who's essentially her student, she assumed he meant alms to the oppressed. He would give alms to the oppressed, right? And she referred him to Prevent. So stories like this, they are picked up by mainstream media, but some of the more nuanced arguments, some of the other issues around Prevent, like, they tend to be ignored. It would be good if people could actually report on some of these things, because otherwise we end up just going through the same cycles, and people will be reluctant to come forward and share their story, especially when stakes are high for them, in that by sharing their story, they could potentially be smeared.
Yeah, there's a kind of sensationalism with those stories where it's like, oh, look what happened to this kid. But there's no acknowledgement of how dehumanizing it is and how disrespectful it is to the child, the family, to like more of these communities. Asra, what do you think about the media angle?
Yes, I broadly agree with Layla, and I think no one in the audience will be surprised at the fact that we don't trust the media to handle this properly. But clearly, their role is clearly more often to launder positive stories about counterterrorism, about Prevent, as not present it as like a nice, touching story of a young child who was deterred from becoming a potential terrorist. We're more likely to hear that than the stories that we hear that Layla mentioned of young people affected by it directly. However, like in around 2015, when Prevent came into law through the Counterterrorism and Security Act, there was immediately more coverage of it. I think a lot of the cases that they mentioned, again, you would have heard come out around that time when it was in public consciousness. And having Prevent, like negative Prevent stories, or not truthful Prevent stories, by the way, in the public media did help in the public's imagination, and did put Prevent on the back foot. And I think what we've seen in the years since then is quite like an offensive from the other side, from Prevent teams and Prevent sort of working groups and Prevent local authorities, where they try and promote Prevent as a positive thing. You have a lot of them doing little posts on like Huffington Post or here and there, trying to present the good side of Prevent from what they see in their eyes, as well as like a lot of stories in local media. So there's a lot of like pro-Prevent, I guess, propaganda that's often copied and pasted from some local Prevent team PR, which is published in like local, like the local town echo or something like that. So I think it's important to recognize that the media has failed to do justice to the issue. But on the other hand, the Prevent side, like the pro-Prevent side, are still scared of media. So it's important to make use of it when you can, but don't go into any illusions, and make that one plank of a sort of broader campaign against Prevent, rather than relying on just the PR battle alone. Because it's just one step, but not all of it.
Yeah, the PR does cast like a certain sheen on it as well. But I think While we're talking about media, I think Emma's got a point for us.
Well, it seemed like the perfect point to bring it up, really, didn't it? So thank you for all of your comments and questions so far. We'll get to those later on in the conversation. We just want to take a minute to talk about what this unit is really focusing on and the crowdfunding that we have launched recently. So we took a lot of thought into designing this unit and creating it and getting it on its feet. And essentially what we do is we dig into government and corporate corruption, we expose abuse of police powers, and we also challenge right-wing narratives. So some of the stuff that Asfar was talking about just then. We also provide a platform for communities ignored by mainstream media and for communities that wouldn't be platformed elsewhere. Since launching the unit about 9 months ago, we've really hit the ground running. During that process, we've created 4 new exciting series, and the link will be below so you guys can take your time and read up on those. What those series are about is that they're really dedicated to informing and transforming people's lives. And we do that by telling the stories that matter. And that's really where you come in. So I think we're going to watch the investigations video now. If you are watching this, you'll know that the world's never been a more confusing place to live in.
Every day there's a deliberate tsunami of misinformation, and the people whose voices we really need to hear are the people whose voices are being silenced.
That's why investigative journalism is so vital today.
That's not just for avid newsreaders, but for everybody that mainstream media has forgotten.
As one of the only true independent investigative units in the country, we work for you. We're not part of the old boys network, and in fact, we're here to break that party up.
That's because we know that behind every headline, there's a person, a family, or a community whose lives are being ripped apart.
So far, we've followed legal cases, dug into the tragic mishandling of the pandemic, and we've kept pressure on big institutions.
We've launched interactive investigations, we've accessed leaked data, and we've worked with activists to uncover human rights violations around the world. But
we want to do more. And that's where you come in. We have set up an investigations fund where the money goes directly back into the work that we do.
We're here to shine a light into the darkness, and that's exactly what we're going to carry on doing with your support.
All donations help, and every penny truly does count.
So join our fight for truth and justice today.
There we go.
Thank you guys for joining us. If you are able to donate during this live or throughout the next 18 days, then please do so. The link will be below. Every donation really does count. So thank you so much in advance. And if you find that you can't donate right now, please support us by being a reader and leaving comments below.
So we've got about 25 minutes left, so we're going to carry on with our conversation, and I think we've got a question, so we'll just bring Asra and Layla back in. Hi, hello again. So the next thing was, I'm just going to quickly explain this thing about vulnerability support hubs, and we've had a question on Facebook from Michael who says, would the panel comment on the Royal College of Psychiatrists endorsing closed supervision centres? These centres are prisons within UK prisons, segregation units where prisoners are locked in their cell 22 or more hours per day for months or years with no independent right of appeal, where 50% of the prisoners are Muslims. So anyone who wants to take it, or I can keep talking, but this is some... Yes, go ahead, sorry.
Okay, well, I guess caveat is that I don't know a great deal about the CSCs per se, but I think the fact from what I hear in the comment, I think the fact that the RC Psych are supporting it or endorsing it is a dereliction of duty, clearly. What I will speak on is something very related. So in 2018, there was a review of quote-unquote Islamist extremism in prisons, probation and the Youth Justice Centre, carried out by the Ministry of Justice. Ian Aitchison was the guy in charge of it. It basically looked at the issue of what the government deems extremism in prisons. I think the main outcome of that was quite a strong recommendation for like segregation units within prisons, which I guess sound very similar to me. What's important to recognize, in the report itself, the sort of behaviours that Ian Aitchison identified as being, warning signs of extremism in prisons were things like, aggressive encouragement of conversion to Islam, unsupervised collective worship, sometimes at Friday prayers, including the pressure on supervising staff to leave the prayer room, books and education materials producing quote-unquote extremist literature available in chaplains libraries, were held by individual prisoners, and exploitation of staff fear of being labeled racist. So it's clear, the issue itself, how like Islamist extremism is constructed, is very much racialized through it's Islamophobic through and through. So I think anything that operates on the basis of especially extremism, right? I know it's not going to be the case for your particular sentence you're talking about, but in this case, what they're recommending is internal segregation units, basically Muslim majority wings, for prisoners that they deem extremists on very Islamophobic and racist grounds, very prejudicial grounds. So kind of all this is empower the existing prison regime to sort of exercise the powers of even less accountability, less oversight, and less transparency. So I think what we're seeing is so where I see this fitting in is like a convergence of like moves to sort of further securitize units like prisons and like psychiatric facilities in a very dangerous way. And I think we should, see this connected as well, campaign them against that on that basis, but see where they fit against the wider picture of trying to lock down certain people even further.
Absolutely, and I think that part of that wider picture is things like vulnerability support hubs, where it is a direct function of prevent, but it functions in the healthcare system where if there are patients with mental health needs who are perceived as aggressive or as a danger to themselves or to others, and they in any way express something which could come under the category of something that needs to be referred to under prevent, their access to healthcare is extremely limited. And in order for the process to happen, healthcare can be, the option of treatment can be taken away from people. And MedAct recently had a report on this that the Canary covered recently, but I think the vulnerability support hubs are another instance, just like CSCs, where surveillance and monitoring is happening in order to use prevent as an excuse for dehumanizing treatment of prisoners, of people that might be referred to, or of patients. So again, this is the problem of pre-crime. Do you have any thoughts on this, Layla?
No, I think, just to kind of highlight one particular point, which I think you've both sort of touched upon, whether it's the vulnerability support hubs or it's something else when it comes to prevent, and when it comes to this idea of like extremism and Muslim communities, it seems that everything is exceptionalized. Everything is almost like extraordinary and needs to be dealt with in a different way to how you would deal with people usually in a situation where they actually need mental health support, not surveillance, or in a situation where they need any other type of support, rather than looking at them with this securitized lens. There are other ways, and they have existed for a long time, and they have worked, and yet all of a sudden, now we're expected to believe that things have changed so much, and whether it's prisoners or whether it's people who suffer from mental health conditions, if they're Muslim, if they fall into the class of extremism, and they need to be dealt with in this extra way, right? This kind of runs through prevent, it runs through pre-crime.
Completely, and I think that the point about what the function of pre-crime is that it's a way for the state to behave in ways that would otherwise be resisted if they weren't targeting certain communities. I've completely lost my train of thought.
I mean, I can jump in. I found it.
Yeah, go for it, Asfar.
Sure. Just the point about the vulnerability support hubs. I think this is like an important case study, like recognizing that prevent counterterrorism more broadly is governed by like fundamentally different laws of motion to like public services we understand them, right? So as I see it, as I believe it, and as I will it, the needs of healthcare, of social care, of education, and so on, are fundamentally irreconcilable with the needs of counterterrorism. So what prevent has done is sort of blur the lines in a massive way, and the fact that building institutions sort of like submit this and sort of institutionalize it is a big issue. Also, I think it's important when people sometimes, well-meaning people, they see prevent as being a bad thing. They don't like the way it sort of targets certain communities and so on. they might try and, again, with the best intentions, say what we need to do is sort of reorient, prevent teams and get to doing more like soft work or soft engagement work, less overtly policing stuff, more community engagement, more social care kinds of role. And I think what this does is sort of misses the point, like sort of merging these two and blurring the line between these two. It does not soften the edges of prevent. It only hardens, securitizes things like welfare and mental health provision. So like fundamentally to sort of reclaim mental health or healthcare as something as a public good for one, also as something that designed to serve people rather than securitizing. You have to get rid of prevent first as a sort of prerequisite for any sort of like broader, more mandatory project. And I guess decoupling those two, so decoupling mental health and prevent, and decoupling welfare more broadly and prevent is vital. And just a second point, I think it's so important in terms of campaigning stuff to always connect the dots where possible. And I guess while I think the Islamophobia is central to how prevent works, it's central to how it's made possible, it's central to how it operates now, sorry. It's also, I don't aware of like exceptionalizing or externalizing as only the preserve, like an issue on for Muslims or Muslim issue. It started as a Muslim issue, but it sort of has a wider like impact and damaging impact in public institutions as a whole, right? I think everyone recognizes they have a stake in opposing prevent. So just in terms of campaigning against prevent, when I saw the news about the Breeding Sport Hubs, I think the first thing that came to mind was the fact that in the report they mentioned how prevent is being used, or see that these hubs are being used in the process of like detention under the Mental Health Act. And there's a long history of the Mental Health Act being used in detention in the policing context of like especially black men. I think 10 years ago this year, Kingsley Burrell was killed in Birmingham after he was detained by police. Section of the Mental Health Act, and then he found himself beat up for one behind closed doors, and then died shortly afterwards. 2003, Mikey Powell, also in Birmingham, similar situation. So I think sort of the intersection between policing and mental health is not unique to prevent, and support we connect these dots in terms of campaigning, how discrimination and intrusion of policing into these services is doing massive damage and massive disservice to what they're trying to do.
And I think that links exactly back to the title for this evening, which references the Strong Nation bizarre song that the government released last week. And I think so much of this is tied up in, like Layla also mentioned, with exceptionalism, where it's about building a particular idea of the British state as safe and secure. And I think it's no accident that British values are defined by the government as something which is to do with democracy and tolerance and mutual respect, because it's creating this opposition that Muslims don't possess those qualities and Muslim countries don't possess those qualities. So it becomes a much broader issue as well of what Muslims think about foreign policy. How do Muslims express their disagreement with prevent? How do Muslims articulate their oppression, essentially? So kind of going off the back of that, what do you think happens when it's scary to be referred to prevent? So when there are children or patients, anybody in a supposedly professional setting that is referred to prevent, how do you think the prevent as a policy, as a concept, as something that structures racism in this country, how do you think it impacts people who are referred?
I think this question is actually something that we haven't even scratched the surface of yet in terms of impact. It's the most important question. It's the question that nobody has asked from government, and they're not going to ask it because it would be opening up a whole new can of worms. We've seen some of the impact, but even then we haven't seen all of the impact yet. We've seen the children who are completely traumatized because they have no idea why they've been singled out, for expressing a view or for playing a game. We've seen parents who are completely traumatized and who do not want to access healthcare. Healthcare services, they don't want to access it because they're afraid that their data is going to be shared. We've seen students who are worried about their further education, and in fact we have had at least one case where it has impacted their further education. It was directly from the prevent referral that their further education was impacted, and this is despite assurances from government when it was exposed a while ago that there was a data sharing agreement between higher education and prevent, that this was not being used to impact their education. This was only being used for support, right? And we have evidence to suggest it has been used. we have people who have actually like physically been sick, right, following the days and weeks after knowing that they've been referred or thinking they're going to be referred to prevent. So we haven't even like scratched the surface of the psychological impact and the physical impact and all the other types of impact, you know, let alone the impact on society and relationships. We haven't scratched the surface. And I'm hoping that through this alternative review, as people put their evidence forward, we can really tease out these particular things. You know, 5 years later, how do you feel about interacting with teachers, with your doctors? It's a really important question. And I think once you start to unravel this and once you start to see the impact, it will be scary. And even the things that are outside of prevent, like the policy documents, the guidance documents, you know, the documents, for example, in universities that look at risk when you're trying to host an event. I mean, those things will still be in existence even if you remove prevent. But where did they come from, right? They came from prevent guidance, and they're there, and people are still looking at it with a particular view. And this is having an impact. It's having a silencing effect, and it's having all sorts of effects.
Yeah, absolutely. Just touching on that, I mean, we've got to the point now where there have been several cases where students have been told, college students have been told that they're not allowed to have conversations about Palestine and politics classes or ethics classes. It's really a question for Asfar, really. What kind of, by not creating an environment where you can have that conversation, how is that going to affect students?
Yeah, I think this is a valuable question. So I first found out about when I was actually at university myself, and that was when it sort of came in as law, right, in 2015, around that time. I think that's when I first got active around it. I think I was at university prior to the parental duty coming in, so that's the legal responsibility, it's called the parental duty. So I was at university before that and after that. And so in terms of the way, like the space in which space in which to organize politically, as like a student group, like a Palestinian society I was involved in, pre-prevent duty and post-prevent duty is like black and white, like day and night, right? Complete difference. Like the level of bureaucracy that's applied, the level of scrutiny that's applied to certain groups, especially Palestinian societies and the Islamic society and so on, was like a whole new world entirely. So definitely has been a very clear move towards like crack down on policing certain groups. But something like roll back a little bit, talk about why like we talk about young people in the context of threat and why it's relevant. So in 2015, when it came into law with the Security Act, Counterterrorism and Security Act 2015, prevent is redefined as safeguarding, right? An extension of pre-existing safeguarding processes any teacher or person dealing with young people or vulnerable people will know about. And so fundamentally, I see that clearly as like a rebrand exercise. Another one, I mean, sort of like again blur the lines between like safeguarding, which is meant to look out for the interests of the individual, and sort of national security policies, which are meant to look out for the interests of crime and national security. And it's fundamentally blurred the lines between those two. And since that move to safeguarding, we've seen sort of referrals of young people, so that's under 21, sorry, how the government categorizes them, has shot up entirely. So since 2015 up until now, in any given year, the referrals of young people is at least 50% in any given year of, I think in 2015, the year after, I think it was 7,631 referrals overall to prevent. And again, half those are young people, under 21. Same last year too. And there's a clear target of young people. And why that matters is that, you know, especially recently, it's been like a big celebratory tone to young people. Young people save us. They're more politically active, more politically engaged, more politically astute than we were at their age. That's definitely true, especially for me. But like in this context, we're placing a lot of hope in that young people. What does it mean for young people who've grown up in a generation, young generation who've grown up in a context where every move being scrutinized, policed, and surveilled in a way that, you know, is completely alien to past generations. And what does it mean to a generation who's grown up steeped in state surveillance almost from cradle to the grave? And ultimately, kids have gone through large parts, like today, even people at university now will have gone through large parts of schooling and college, not knowing anything other than the threat in their school. So again, I think there's like a question which no one has an answer to yet, I don't think. But like, what it will become a generation who's one, reckoning with a political crisis that is incomparable to anything that came before. Also dealing with like a society that is more overtly and viciously opposed to them exercising themselves politically or democratically. I think that sort of divergence would be quite interesting to see, but also quite potentially dangerous in terms of like the impacts we're having on young people. So short answer is we're stealing it.
Thank you.
Brilliant,
Yeah.
thank you. I think we're going to move into final comments from our guests now. Layla, if you'd like to offer your final opportunity to talk about either the report or the review or the People's Review, that would be amazing.
So I think we've just launched the People's Review recently. We hope that throughout the next few weeks and months, we can start disseminating some of the information and some of the stories. So we'll definitely be updating people with case studies and any other evidence that comes forward that we feel we can disseminate at a particular time. So do keep an eye out on that. I think just one kind of last comment, because it can feel quite disempowering when you talk about all the impact of Prevent. And just off the back of Afam's comment about, how students and children are reacting and the fact that they are predominantly referred to Prevent, I think this fresh wave of Palestinian activism in particular has shown us actually that the youth of today and the students of today are well ahead from where we were, and they've shown a certain confidence and a certain way of articulating their arguments that hasn't really shown that level of fear that I think some of us may feel as slightly older generation. I say only slightly older generation, but especially with like the knowledge of Prevent. And you can imagine, if those children had spoken maybe to their parents prior to saying or demonstrating or doing things that they were doing at school, you can imagine their parents would probably say, no, don't do that, you'll get referred to Prevent, and completely, disempower them and stop them from trying to do it, as I'm sure, my parents probably would say to me. So I think with each generation, there seems to be a bolder, outlook and a more confident outlook. And so I'm quite hopeful that actually, the students coming up today, yes, there is a lot of pressure on them. Yes, there has been a lot of impact. They don't really know world pre-Prevent, but I also am very, very hopeful that, they are a really confident and strong generation that are coming through.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I think of my sisters who there's a 10-year age gap there, and the way that they talk about Islamophobia is like planets away from my understanding of it when I was that age. And I feel like that is the thing that gives me the most hope, that all of the things that we've talked about, younger generations have more access to that and are doing really interesting, cool things with it that are building against things like the Show Cross Review. They can see it for the PR opportunity that it is. Asfar, I wanted to ask you, in your pre-crime report, you mentioned the imagined possibility of violence as a description of what pre-crime policing is. So now that we are talking about future generations and we're talking about ways that people are trying to record and speak to each other about the harm that Prevent does, could you tell us a little bit about how pre-crime functions in that, or just if there's anything that you think we haven't touched on yet?
So I didn't quite get the question. Could you repeat that a bit?
Yeah, so in the Strangers in Fiction report, it describes pre-crime as the imagined possibility of violence in the future. So we've mentioned what pre-crime is and how it works and how damaging it is, because it's an attempt to control expressions of Islam, fundamentally. So could you tell us a little bit either about what that means for future generations? So Layla's mentioned how kids are resisting in a different way than older generations would be, or if not that, if there's anything else that you'd like to add.
Yeah, to be honest, I think Layla said a lot about how I would have thought. That's probably more eloquently than I would have. But I guess to reinforce the point, I definitely, while recognizing that a lot of pressure's up against them, I do want to repeat that. I do have a lot of faith in the kids as well. And I think there will be, so we have seen a drive towards self-policing because of Prevent being in place, and people are not saying what, young kids, university students, whatever, not saying what otherwise we want to say. It doesn't go away. Like, the questions don't go away, to find other ways of articulating it, and more creative ways of doing it. So in terms of political organizing, I think that's a positive thing in the sense, people might want to speak a different way, but they can't be stopped effectively. Not just asking specifically, but I think it's important. Yeah. That's another question though. So we have a sort of solution to how do you deal with the impasse sort of find yourself in the last few years, where like Ben Wallace's statement, as I mentioned earlier, he said he asked people who criticize prevent, what do you do? And they say they describe prevent, but find that go back to being about the brand being tainted. We think there is a way we need to sort of go beyond conversations about prevent that have been sort of stuck in the last few years, and doesn't just assume the same predicates that prevent is sort of built on, right? It doesn't assume that the question of extremism and radicalization, as is defined by the government, is a valid point. It doesn't assume that certain communities have had propensity to violence as the government does, right? We need to go beyond just like reorienting around sort of assumptions that prevent has sort of already established, right? We need sort of a broad exercise of rethinking society, because we also recognize that campaigning against prevent is not just a reactive exercise, right? It's a society making exercise, it's a world making exercise. So we did early last year, we published a report called Beyond Prevent, a real alternative to securitized policies, and basically we identify a new way of thinking about prevent and looking at prevent, right? And I think as part of that, we identified an 8-point plan to get into a world beyond prevent, where one, prevent is gone for one. Also, the sort of the reasons that prevent justifies its existence no longer exist too, right? If that makes sense. So like prevent's program is gone, but also the way that prevent is justified through recourse ideas of certain risks being out there, or political violence being an issue, also dealt with. So as part of the exercise, we started rather than thinking about prevent as being like the 0 point, or extremism being the 0 point, we talked about how do you create healthy, safe societies, and from there we sort of had 3 cascading points coming out of that, of addressing root grievances among sections of the population, countering disenfranchisement and alienation among certain populations, and thirdly, dismantling the repressive policy architecture of preventing counterterrorism. So maybe rather than go in detail, I'll talk about maybe share the report link in the comments. I think the idea is that we have an 8-point plan now of how we go beyond prevent, and each of those 8 points will require a campaign going forward. And I think this is a place for everybody in there. Again, everyone has a stake in it, prevent, even if they're not directly impacted by it, even if not Muslim prevent is an issue for them. And I think most, concrete example of the fact is that 10 years ago, of 11 years of austerity now, I've had, and at the same time that sort of public funding has been stripped away and drained away from public. We've had sort of counter-extremism funding filling in the gap. So we have now, as we once had a sort of semi-independent civil society funded by public funding, whatever problems there were, because there are problems. That sort of space has been massively narrowed, whereby that funding is taken away, and now the precondition for getting funding and maintaining funding is like towing the government line in a lot more harsh way than it used to be. British values, as you mentioned earlier, is a core part of that. So again, if you're interested in anti-austerity struggles, then getting rid of prevent should be part of that, because we recognize that the shifting of funding from one stream to the other is damaging. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Fantastic, thank you so much. It's really interesting what you both have picked up on about the positivity of having young activists and campaigning, and also really good dedication to investigative journalism as well. It's something that we've tried to make a focus when we've been designing the unit to investigate programs like this, and to keep on top of holding people to account. So thank you so much both for joining us.
Thank you. We really can't thank you enough for doing this and for coming and sharing your insights.
Thank you for having us on. Thanks.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for the work that you do.